Father Joachim, can you tell us a little bit about your biography, your background, how you became a Franciscan friar and a priest?
My biography. So I'm German. I was born in Germany in 1961, and my first intellectual interests in life really were the sciences. Once I was getting old enough to really discover what I wanted to do with my life, and really just thought about what kind of life I wanted as an adult, what kind of professional life. I was always attracted to the sciences. Science and engineering, and understanding the world in that way was just very enjoyable intellectual activity. I just liked it. And we had an astronomy observatory in our school, and I just loved doing astronomy and kind of gazing into the night sky and trying to observe, to learn, to understand. It was quite wonderful. And I had a chemistry lab in my parents' house's basement, so I could do some experiments. And I liked the hands-on work of experimental sciences. So this is why, when it came to picking a field to study, I chose chemistry as my main discipline of studies. Now, all the while, I was born to Catholic parents and to a Catholic family, and so Catholicism was part of my life from the earliest days, really. I went to a Catholic school for the first 4 years of my education, then a regular public school like it's customary in Germany. We had religious education, we went to church on Sundays, and all of that meant a lot to me. It was part of my life. But to be honest, I was not all that active, especially as a young adult in church life. Like many young adults, I kind of slowly drifted away. And back then, I never really thought of my faith as being something which is more than a cultural heritage that was important to me and guided me in ethical decision-making, but I didn't see it as something that really made sense in the same way as I would say that scientific inquiry makes sense. It was many, many years until I discovered philosophy and the benefits we can have from studying philosophy. So I was very much a scientist who thought all we can know about the world is in the sciences. I was reasonably good at it. I had a nice career. I got a Ph.D. in biochemistry from the University of Munich. And then I came to the US thereafter. It was in 1990. And I worked as a postdoctoral fellow for a short while at Princeton University. Then my supervisor at the time decided to move to the Sloan Kettering Institute. So I got to live in New York City for 3 years as a research fellow, which was a wonderful time. And then I took a position as an assistant professor of biochemistry at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. After 3 years in New York, I was definitely ready for a very different environment. And I really liked living in Nashville. It was a wonderful experience. I quite enjoyed it. But in that time, two things changed. One thing that changed was that the scientific life of a student or a research fellow is very different from the life of a faculty member. It was no longer fun of research and discovery. It was about writing grants, attending meetings, and all of that. And really, probably at least half of my work days was just writing grant application after grant application, where I had to predict precisely what I wanted to discover and what I would find. And that took the fun out of it. It just wasn't what I had really wanted to do. The other thing that changed was that I became active again in the church. So back when I was living in Nashville, I was part of a very engaging, active Catholic community at the parish that I attended, St. Henry Church. And that really started to make me think as to whether I shouldn't know more about my faith, whether I shouldn't start investigating my faith more in depth. So I became more active again in my faith life. I was starting to study a little bit, to read a little bit. I read things like St. Augustine's autobiography. And that gave me a deeper appreciation as to what it is that my faith has to offer to me in making sense of life, in really living happily and fully. Now, after my time at Vanderbilt University, since I wasn't really doing so well as an academic assistant professor, I didn't get enough grant money, and I thought if it's all about money, then maybe I should put that first. So I had a sabbatical of a year that I spent at the EMBL, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory in Heidelberg, to discern. But after that was over, I decided to enter into a biotech company. I had a very nice job offer from a good friend and collaborator from my academic life, who was a co-founder of a company in Montreal, in Canada. And he said, well, you can come there. You can also do some academic work at McGill University, but your main job could be in biotech. That was a very nice opportunity. And I thought, great, that's my chance to become financially independent and to make enough money that I don't have to worry about the practicalities any longer. And well, I did that for several years. I worked in Montreal at one company, and then after a few years, I actually co-founded another company that took me to Toronto and then to Vancouver. And it would have been in 2007 or so that I realized that I had kind of made enough money in that line of work that for a single guy who doesn't have that many obligations, I could retire quite comfortably. I was in my mid-40s, and I knew perfectly well if I didn't want to work any longer, that was an option. I could continue to work if I wanted to, but I didn't have to. So I had this complete freedom to discern what I wanted to do, but I really wasn't happy with not having a clearly defined purpose and to be needed and to really know what it is that God wants me to do, what it is really that I'm meant to be doing. And playing golf wouldn't make a lot of sense to me, and I've never played golf. I'm not very good at it. So taking it up at that age, I didn't think so. Now, just by coincidence, I went on a retreat. My parish in Vancouver at the time, or the Newman Association of Vancouver at the time, had offered a retreat at the Benedictine monastery, which is just outside of Vancouver in Mission. And that was the first time, really, that I visited a monastery and spent just a few days there. So Friday to Monday, something like that. But I was like taken into an entirely different environment where people there were thinking so completely differently from the way you think in a research lab or in a biotech company where it's all very much focused on material things. So this immersion experience of just living my faith in this environment, that triggered something in me. That's really where I thought, this is what I'm meant to do. Now, of course, if that happens, you can't just go to the abbot and sign up for religious life and they send you away right away. They know it's just an enthusiastic moment. So I was smart enough to keep it to myself. But I went to my pastor afterwards and I said, I think something happened here and we should talk about it. And we did for about 3 to 6 months and discerned and considered very seriously what had happened, what I was called to do. And then indeed, I did decide to enter religious life. Now, I didn't join the monks in the monastery. That I realized that with my background, my interest in the sciences, I didn't really feel called to be in the monastery. I wanted to be more in the world. And my pastor at the time told me right away, this is not about your work. You can be a scientist if you want to enter religious life. That's perfectly okay. This is about the form of life that you want to live, that you're called to. And that's how I discovered the Franciscan friars. And their spirituality really attracted me, and I became a friar. And so I joined the postulancy program, the first step of formation, where we spent time with the community for about a year, and then discern whether we are called to enter novitiate. But then I took one step after the other, and indeed, after about 5 or 6 years, I professed my solemn vows as a Franciscan friar. Now, my decision to become a priest is separate from that. My discovery of my vocation to be a priest. And when I joined the Franciscans, I just wanted to be a Franciscan. And some of us are brothers, some are priests, but we are all Franciscans. That is a separate decision-making process. But during novitiate, when I prayed over it and thought about it, I really felt strongly drawn to sacramental ministry. And of course, I had been a lay person in the church at that point already for more than 40 years. So I thought maybe I should stay that. There's nothing wrong with that. Actually, quite liked being a lay person in the church. So why suddenly become a cleric? But I just discerned that I really felt called to do sacramental ministry. And I discussed it with my formators, the men who were in charge of my formation as a Franciscan friar. And I told them that I'm committed to being a Franciscan. I would also like to be ordained to the priesthood. If you agree, then I would be very happy about that. And they did agree. So I was ordained to the priesthood, and now I'm a priest. It's a great privilege to be a priest. It's a wonderful vocation. I highly recommend it to anybody who has that calling. It allows me to be a symbol of Christ in the world, to draw people towards the real expression of meaning in the world, to Jesus Christ, and to do that in my ministry, in the sacramental ministry of the Church. I find that a wonderful experience, and it draws me to the one center that allows me to make sense of everything, the Word of God revealed to us in Jesus Christ. It's not an ideology that I'm trying to understand. It's not a worldview that I'm trying to kind of put everything in its place. It's just this one encounter. And I'm very happy to have found that in my ministry as a priest and in my life as a Franciscan friar.
And maybe one follow-up on that. Since you became a friar, can you tell us a little bit about the extent of continued work professionally or otherwise in the sciences, or have you taught at all, or how's that worked out?
I taught one course once when I was living in Edmonton. It didn't go all that well. It takes a while to get good at teaching, and I didn't really put in the time to really learn how to teach. The real question that interests me is faith and science. How do faith and science relate to each other, and how can science students make sense of their faith as well as what they learn in the sciences? And how can people of faith draw on the knowledge of the natural sciences? In an ordinary class of biochemistry or cell biology, which are topics I could teach, you don't really touch on these matters. So this is why teaching these subjects, I would be happy to do it if there were a need for it. But there's also a large number of very highly qualified graduates in the science programs who are happy to do this work and do it very, very well. And I didn't think there was a real need for me to do that. So and of course, the time it takes to study theology and to prepare for ordination, that didn't leave me a lot of time to do anything else. That really meant I had to focus on it, and I didn't follow the work being done in my field. However, now that I've moved to Montreal just a few weeks ago, I'm again close to McGill University, and one of my friends from my scientific career is still working at McGill University. And on Tuesday, when I come back to Montreal, we're actually going to meet in the afternoon. And maybe I can spend a few hours each week to kind of connect with the researchers I used to work with. And maybe there's something. But my real passion now is how can I reconcile faith and science? How can I make sense of that?
So you've spoken about awe and wonder, the awe and wonder that a scientist experiences in the lab, in their interaction with nature. Can you tell us a little bit more of that and your experience of that as a scientist?
Okay. So I mentioned astronomy at the beginning, and I think for a great many scientists, their first encounter with awe and wonder is just the night sky, to look at the night sky and to see the beauty of what we see there, and then to be able to make sense of it, to kind of explain it in a very abstract and in a way that is so remote from our experience, but still true and as real here as it is elsewhere. That kind of draws you into the questions as to what is it all about? Why are we surrounded by this great mystery of the astronomical universe that in which we are enclosed? That it leads to deep questions, and it is fascinating. Or then when I was doing chemistry, and I didn't have an interest in biochemistry early on. I was more interested in the physical sciences. I thought I would do physical chemistry in my as a graduate student. But then I read about biochemistry, and I thought I should at least read a little bit about it to know what it's about. But then I got hooked. And it was such a growing area in the late 70s and early 80s. that I really realized the most significant discoveries in the next 20 years will be made in biochemistry, molecular biology. So I wanted to be part of that. I went into that. But I remember very well, I had learned organic chemistry for many years before I learned biochemistry. And in organic chemistry, when you do synthetic organic chemistry, the more complicated the molecule gets, the more steps you have, the longer it takes to get there, the lower the yield is. Organic chemistry can be very frustrating. You start with these huge buckets of chemicals at the beginning, you have a tiny amount at the very end. And it's really, it can be quite annoying to have these low yields. But then biochemistry, it goes automatically. And then you have molecules like DNA, they replicate. It's like for an organic chemistry, a self-replicating molecule. It's like it makes itself. I have to do nothing. This is really, it's mysterious and wonderful. So that caught me in biochemistry. I didn't go back to organic chemistry after that. But there's also another dimension that we should mention, because we know that as wonderful and fascinating nature is, there is the encounter with something which is darker, which is fear-inspiring and dangerous. So when I worked in my professional career as in biotechnology, we worked on finding cures for diseases. Those were antibody therapies, to raise antibodies which have therapeutic activity against cancer, or later on, the second company, antibodies against enzymes that form clumps, that aggregate, which destroy the brain, like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and also ALS. And the idea was to find antibodies that prevent these aggregates from forming and can dissolve them again. And you kind of wonder, you have these beautiful protein structures, but something can go wrong with them that creates a structure that keeps recruiting similar molecules to that same structure and causes simply a toxic clump of protein in your brain interfering with its function, taking away the beauty of somebody's life. Suddenly this person becomes somebody else because his or her brain deteriorates. It is a terrible experience to see such suffering and to see people go through it. And it is wonderful that we can use our knowledge, our understanding to develop cures, but you also ask yourself, why is there this property to nature which is not only beautiful and awe-inspiring, but sometimes also fearful? That's a question that we all struggle with. Nobody has found a correct answer on it yet.
Fantastic. So the late Stephen Hawking, the very famous physicist, theoretical physicist, has said that, and I'll quote him here, "The human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies. We are so insignificant that I can't believe the whole universe exists for our benefit. That would be like saying that you would disappear if I closed my eyes." So could you reflect, how do you think he gets to this view, and where do you think he has gone wrong?
Well, there's so much that would have played into him taking this position, and so many turns that he could have taken differently, that it's hard to know where to begin. I'll just mention how I even know of Stephen Hawking. And again, when I was in astronomy in the 70s as a teenager, we learned about his work. Our astronomy teacher was very interested in keeping us up to date on modern developments. So I learned about his work of combining quantum mechanics and relativity to explain radiation being emitted from black holes. It was quite fascinating. That was a major accomplishment for Stephen Hawking. And that was already the time when he had been diagnosed with something like ALS. I think it was different because he lived so long with it. It wouldn't be an ordinary ALS, but something like that. And we knew there was this conflict between this beautiful mind with this brilliant insights as a young man and did truly groundbreaking work in cosmology, was suffering from this incurable disease that made his life a very great burden on him. So without psychologizing, it does seem natural to ask oneself whether his own suffering has something to do with the position that he took on the meaning of biological life that he expresses in that sentence. Now, at the same time, what he quotes there has been said before. And you know that Arthur Eddington has written something like that in the 1930s, famous physicist of that generation. And he writes there that it almost seems as if life is just the gruesome accident of the cosmos's failure to take antiseptic precautions. Everything else is so cold or so hot in the universe that nothing can happen that would be as messy as life. But Eddington was a bit more careful. He kind of raised the question and kind of pointed to the obvious. Of course, life is beautiful and significant. And to speak of it in such terms is just, it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't capture our experience of being alive and how much we enjoy that. But if we get too deeply drawn into the strictly physical approach of things, then we get lost. Like he says, it would be insane to think it is all about, or unreasonable to think it is all about us. Well, first of all, if you look at ancient religious texts, they say the heavens proclaim the glory of God, not of the human person. So it's about the glory of God, which is revealed in creation. We should keep that in mind. And so nobody's ever claimed it is all for our benefit, in that naive sense. That is not the way it works. So in that sense, he is quite right that this is it is the glory of God which is revealed. But how is it revealed? And he says, well, it's an average planet. Well, is the meaning of it all being revealed in the average or in the exceptional? You could say if it's exceptional, the exception, then it's not about it, it's about the ordinary. But if our existence is ordinary in the cosmos, then why couldn't it be the meaning of it all? So there's something, the question of what makes it significant, he doesn't address it at all. He jumps to a conclusion there. And I think he, in a way, he just chose to give up on truly finding the meaning of the cosmos, of the created universe, in human life itself. And there's a choice. There's a choice we have to make, whether we take our own existence truly, fully seriously. Not so much in spite of its suffering, but because of its suffering. That draws us into the question as to what do we do this for? And those who take the wrong turn there are likely to end up with a very physicalist worldview that can't really see significance and meaning in life as being more important than significance and meaning that you might find in mathematical physics.
Maybe one follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
One dimension of this question or this view is the equating of size and significance,
Mm-hmm.
And that's always struck me as a puzzling move.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, though, I believe you have identified, I've heard you identify the great size of the universe, the scale, and also cosmic time, so the scale of time, as somehow disturbing or a source of uneasiness.
Mm-hmm.
How do you navigate that, or why do you think that somehow the scale in time or in space of our cosmos can be troubling to us without sort of making a somewhat questionable and simplistic connection between size and significance?
The question that comes up in discussions sometimes is that, well, if the cosmos still has billions of years ahead of us, and our species, Homo sapiens, is about 200,000 years old, and lifetimes of species typically are measured in the hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Does that mean we are just kind of one fluke of many flukes of development? Is the cosmos meant to give rise to some other kind of conscious personal being or not? And that seems to take away the significance of our lives. And I think the challenge is is somewhat real. It is quite real. But the answer to it is, what do we mean with these numbers? We know from personal relationship that closeness is more significant than remoteness. If we think of relationship between people as being, between individuals, as being significant, as being what gives meaning to the cosmos, then what is at a close proximity to us in space and time has more significance than what is at a great distance from us. So a way to interpret the great distances in space and time is to emphasize the reduced significance by virtue of being removed from us in space and time. The big mistake that people make is trying to look at the world as a whole, as a complete, like from the divine perspective. Then you have this gigantic cosmos. But this is not our view. Our view is from the inside. We are creatures in creation. We look from the inside out. And what is close by is more significant to us than what is far removed in space and in time. So this is why, as much as I love mathematical physics describing the cosmos as a whole, that is less significant to me and less tells me much less about what it means to be a human person than life as I live it every day.
It's very common to distinguish science from scientism or physicalism from physics, but people do that differently. How do you understand that difference, and why is it important?
The difference between science and scientism is that science is a part of our human knowing, and scientism takes the part and makes it the whole, the everything, the complete. When science remains embedded in a larger view of what it means for human beings to find meaning in the world, to understand the world, to express true knowledge of the world, then science is very powerful and undoubtedly true. But when science becomes the point of reference, and the physical sciences in particular, the point of reference for all that we consider true, then it turns into an ideology that tries to give the answer to every question that we're allowed to ask, an ideology that doesn't allow to ask any other questions, and tries to rule it all, to govern it all. That becomes a very confining way of looking at the world, and a very dangerous way of looking at the world. So physicalism, scientism, they're to me somewhat synonymous, but in ordinary parlance and the way the terms are usually used in ordinary language, scientism is a little bit broader in the sense that it embraces a mindset that gives science too much power over our lives, that allows science to be the only judge as to what is true and what is false. That is too limiting. And critiquing it is not a critique of science at all. It simply recognizes that science has to be in some larger context, which is the context of the human person making sense of the world.
Can you say more about what's missing from that view that you think is the beginning mistake of just looking at the physical?
I think we saw it in the quote that we talked about by Stephen Hawking. We lose sight of the significance of our own lives, or more likely, in his case, we lose sight of the connection between the significance of our own lives and the significance of nature as we encounter it. I remember hearing a quote by this famous evolutionary biology Dawkins, isn't it? And who was called by a friend asked him about kind of meaning, and Dawkins responding, well, the cosmos, the universe may not have any meaning, but my life certainly has meaning. And this is a very typical way that somebody who has a very scientific view might look at things. They say the world has no meaning at all. It's just science playing out by its own rules, but their own lives have meaning. That's true. They got that right. But they fail to see that the meaning that they have in their own lives has to be connected to what they know from the sciences. What we consider good and meaningful or good or beautiful that has to somehow be relatable to what we know from the sciences. Otherwise, we have the strict separation of facts and meaning, and no dialogue between them, or spirit and matter. It's some kind of like Gnosticism, where we simply say that our existence as a meaningful, meaning-seeking being is entirely separate from our existence as material creatures in the body. And especially for the Christian, these things have to be kept together. Our understanding of nature by the sciences, when we call it true, we already say that this is meaningful. Truth is always meaningful. We always draw consequences from true understanding. But that aspect of science has to be integrated with what else we know to be true.
I'd like to ask a broad question about when you talk about the importance of the human person, can you just say more about what is important about the human person? What do you encounter when you encounter a human person?
A real being, not a figment of my imagination, not just something which can be there or not be there, depending on whether I want it to be there or not to be there. When I encounter another human person, I encounter reality in two ways. Reality is simply, I am not alone. It's not all in my head. There are others out there with whom I share the experience of life, of the world. And then encounter an ethical demand. When you see another person, when you truly recognize that person as a person, you recognize not simply a tool for your disposal, somebody has to do what you tell him or her to do, but you recognize a person who has a demand on you to respond, to take seriously, to engage, to care for, to love. There's an ethical demand that we see immediately in any encounter with a human person whom we recognize and accept as a human person. So it's an encounter with reality by seeing a person, but it's also a demand, reality calling on us to respond. We are drawn into a network of human relationships by encountering another person. This is really where everything comes together, where our understanding of reality, ontology, as philosophers would say, emerges together with our understanding of what we ought to do in reality, our ethics. Ethics and ontology both are grounded in this meeting of another person, and understanding that our access to reality is entirely founded on this encounter. So in a human person, I don't see a property. Some of them are conscious, some are not. It is not a cultural standard. It's not something we can agree on where personal being begins. When I encounter a person, I know that I have encountered a human being and recognized it to be a person, to be a real being with all the ethical demands that come with it. So every human being is a person.
And the person is not exhausted by their qualities, their attributes?
The unity of these qualities and attributes, the persisting unity of that, the foundational element that allows this unity to persist, the part of you that is truly your own, that you can never fully share with others, the part of you that cannot be defined, the part that really is who you are and withstands any external definition, the part that you don't even know of yourself, the way God looks at you. That is what I mean by person.
So that person, that encounter with the person, the scientist is that person. And the scientists going into the lab, working with other scientists, are people, are persons working together on this scientific project. The assistant professor of biochemistry is a person, and he's teaching his students who are people. the scientific enterprise is an enterprise for people, but it's also at the same time, it seems like an enterprise that seems to strive to be impersonal, objective, and it can be easy to forget that people are pursuing this enterprise. So how do you, could you reflect on that a little bit? And could you talk a little bit about how you see the tension between, or you navigate the impersonal aspect, the impersonal dimensions so central to science, navigate that aspect of science's relationship to the people who are doing it?
You're quite right. The practical pursuit of science is as human an endeavor as everything else and suffers from all the faults that you would find in any organization run by us. The desire for success, financial successes, my own life, and also the desire for fame, the desire to be recognized at whatever cost necessary. All of that, of course, is present in science. And just as people joke about the divinity of the Catholic Church, of having survived for so many years in spite of all of its failing, you can argue for the truth contents in science, for having survived for so many generations now, in spite of the scientists and their failings who do the work. So, of course, there's a significant dimension of mistakes and errors and selfishness that does distort science to some degree. But at the end of the day, science has the power to correct its errors and to make steady progress. And I've seen this in my own engagement with science and errors that have been made that were eventually fixed. So there's certainly the power for self-corrections in science. Now, that's the optimistic view. I have gotten a little bit more skeptical lately. The trouble is that in order for science to be self-correcting, we have to have a reverence for truth. We have to understand that there's something sacred about the pursuit of science, that being a good scientist is not simply being successful financially and career-wise, but that being a good scientist is an attitude of the heart and of the mind and of the spirit that really makes us desire to find truth before anything else. It's really about truthful understanding and nothing else. So I wish more monks and friars were scientists, because we could afford to do science in that way without having to worry about our careers and the necessary compromises. But a reverence for truth is really, for any scholar, anybody who wants to be scientific in the broad sense, to get true understanding, we have to have a reverential attitude for truth. The scientific enterprise at universities has gotten so big, so much money is tied up in it, the commercial interests are so very high that I am a little bit worried about whether science can continue the successful journey that it has been on for so many generations. So this is really why what I'm doing is not so much to save religion against an onslaught of scientism. I also think we need to save science from an onslaught of scientism that takes away the significance of the truth-seeking that a good scientist ought to pursue.
So you're familiar with the view that the person addressing you, me, is really a set of atoms that's arranged a particular way into cells, and there's a brain, there's neurons firing and so forth. And that when you examine the person before you, that's really what you find, is all these atoms and subatomic particles arranged a particular way. And what's happening there is just the laws of physics applied to this particular set of atoms right now that's forming these questions for you. Say more about what you think is wrong with that description of what's happening when I ask you a question.
In order to really turn that around again, one has to go a very long and difficult route of understanding. The starting point there is that you say, when I look at that person, and study that person, I find atoms. That is one way of looking at a person. I would not necessarily conclude it is the best way of looking at a person. I gave you already another answer, which I find is more significant and more primary and more true than the atoms, which are abstractions of our understanding that we have only discovered rather recently, and which of course also are assembly of simpler particles. So for myself, that was a journey of several years until I found my way out of that way of looking at the world to another way of looking at the world, putting persons first. And it is more a process of not so much nailing the argument and responding in one sentence, but a process of slowly guiding people back to what is more natural for their way of thinking, which is the encounter with personal being. So when somebody asked me that question, like in a casual dialogue, then what I ask is, do you take your own existence seriously? Do you ever wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm just a bag of atoms waking up in the morning? No, that's not. We know perfectly well that we are something quite different from just an assembly of atoms. A rock could be just an assembly of atoms, and that captures most of the things you can say about that rock, if not everything. But you know that while you and the rock both are assemblies of atoms in a manner of speaking, your being is of a different kind from the rock. Not just different properties, but the being of persons is a knowing of reality that a rock or an animal never has. You relate to reality, including your own, in a very different way from the atoms that you find in your body. So this opens a set of questions which simply makes you think as to how do I encounter reality? What is really real? Is it the atoms or is it me? And slowly, slowly, I'm trying to convince people who started out where I started out that it is your own identity which is more real and therefore more significant than the existence of the atoms that you learned about much later in life, which speak to reality. But there's a difference between what they are about and what you are about.
So when we describe a person as a bag of atoms or a bag of biochemical stew, is that just missing? We just need to drop the person molecule in. We're missing that's sort of capturing most of our parts and missing some of our parts, or what's missing? How do I get the person back?
By going back to the beginning. It's not a matter of putting it back in. There's no person stuff that we could mix with the physical stuff in order to create a human person. That's not the way it works. The analogy that I like to use to compare the physical description of reality with reality is a street map. The street map of Chicago, for example, gives you all kind of knowledge about the world, where the streets are. It describes those streets in a certain way. It allows you to navigate the city, to go from point A to point B. It is true knowledge of Chicago that is expressed on that map. It is quite real in that sense. But you can't add the buildings and the people of Chicago to that map and then have reality. You have to recognize the map is real, but you obtained it by taking stuff away. And then end up with a very abstract description of reality. But it's not so abstract that building it up again really destroys what you have there. When you put those buildings back into the map, then of course it's no longer a map, it's something completely different. So our physical description of reality is a bit like that. We can't take it and then say, well, how do I put back in what I threw away at the beginning? We have taken it out and then built something that can only exist because we have taken out what it means to be a person. But the fact is that yes, what physics gives us now is a true description. It is true. But it cannot become supplemented to really be the fullness of reality. when you build something by taking away at the beginning, then you can't put it back in at the end.
So there's an account of the history of the universe. There are things we don't know, but there are things we think we do know. It starts with the Big Bang and a kind of quark soup, and then atoms form, and then stars and galaxies and planets and us. So there's this picture that a lot of scientists would say, well, that's the big picture, and it's a picture of fields and quanta of the fields governed by the physical law, and it seems that quite comprehensive. It's the whole picture. Fields, quanta, the physical law, and it covers everything and yields the future from the present. So I take it you think that that's in some ways that captures some important things about the world, but it makes some mistakes. Can you say more about the kinds of things you think are mistaken in that big picture?
Yeah. Do you like the TV series The Big Bang Theory?
I'm actually the guy that doesn't.
I think it's very amusing. But of course, the opening song of The Big Bang Theory is this narrative as to the narrative of the cosmos. Very quick, very fast, very speedy. And then, of course, the whole show is about human relationships amongst those scientists. And I happen to think that this TV show is basically one long joke about physicalism and scientism that wants to make the point that, yes, physical reality, like summarized there in this opening song, is real, but it is such a tiny part of reality as we really care about it. There's a completely different understanding of reality expressed in the human relationship. So this is why to give significance to this long history has to be relativized. It has to be seen as being significant as our way of understanding a collection of extremely abstract observations, like the microwave background radiation, the redshift of galaxies, astronomical observations. We have to, in order to really understand where the data come from for cosmological theory building, you have to look very long and very hard, and it's not exactly self-evident to you, and also far removed from the human experience of life. So we discover something which is significant, and we are inspired by it. It's awe-inspiring. It is wonderful. It calls for reverence even, that we can understand the cosmos in this way. But we have to put it in its right place. We have to realize we are learning something about what God has made. It proclaims the glory of God in a way. But we can't use that to make sense of our lives right here and now.
It reminds me of the psalm, right? What is man that you should think of him?
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
I like to juxtapose what is man that you should think of him and for God so loved the world, right? These two passages, because I think that, and I really like how you sort of identified in this this error or unchristian perspective on judging the significance of the whole cosmos, recognizing that this huge cosmos doesn't proclaim the greatness of me, right? Or that my significance is undermined by the vastness of the universe. That's not a problem, right? Right? Looking at the universe, what is man that you should think of him, right?
It leads to the question, and the more we understand nature, the more we understand its beauty, its complexity, and its independence of us, and how much larger it is than we are. This clearly leads to that very question: what is man? What are human persons? How come we have these astonishing powers that animals do not have, to reflect on being, to reflect on existence, not to mention to understand nature and to use it to our benefit? And how does this relate to it all? It raises a huge question, no doubt about it. And philosophy cannot answer that question. Philosophy can lead us to the question, but then it has to leave it open. And then we have choices as a fundamental choice. as Christians, we share the belief that God revealed himself to us in Jesus Christ. When you say, what is man, and you look at Christ, you will respond very differently from who is man or what is man when you have no faith and no hope of divine revelation. And then you can find yourself in situations of hopelessness and despair where our significance is abolished, where we are nothing relative to creation and only in some kind of tragic opposition create our own meaning against the universe. I can see how a person chooses this route. I cannot prove this person wrong. But for me at least, in the encounter with God, in his word, in the sacraments, in the church, in Jesus Christ, the answer was, man is a lot more than we think he or she is.
When we look at the physical world, there's this striking fact that a vast amount of it is inanimate and does seem to be captured. Its evolution in time is captured by the physical law. Then there's inanimate matter. And as far as we know today, it only occurs once here on Earth. And on Earth, it only started once. What do you make of life? What's going on when inanimate matter becomes animated?
As a biochemist, I would have to respond that life is nothing more than combination of biochemical reaction cycles, which by a flow of energy through it is maintained at a homeostatic state, far from equilibrium, for extended period of times. I don't think anybody would feel inspired to live life in a good, complete, and happy way by this description. So the question, what is life, ought to be answered by living it, and by living it well, and by learning what a well-lived life is about from looking at living beings. What it means to live well means something different for a rabbit out in the woods than it means for a human person. But they both are alive and they both have the ability to live well. But the question has to be answered by looking at living beings. You phrased the question as if I could answer what is life by looking at the atoms and the biochemistry. I can't. But that's not because for the reason that I haven't figured it out yet. It is simply that the atoms and the molecules and the biochemistry has abstracted life at the beginning and tries to describe life in the terms of inanimate chemistry. It does do so. It works very well, I know it quite well, but it doesn't capture life. The question, what is life, cannot be answered by biochemistry. What biochemistry can do is give us circumstances and the requirements in inanimate matter for life to be. But if you want to know what is life, what does it mean, then you have to live it. There's one thing I wanted to add to the compartmentalizing. So why is it important that we keep our understanding of faith and science together?
Good.
And also our understanding of the arts and entertainment and all of it, that we truly get an attempt not to get a comprehensive view of everything, but an awareness of the connection of it all. And that was the matter of being respectful and reverential towards true understanding. A person who strictly compartmentalizes faith and science in his or her life will have to put one thing before the other. You can't serve two masters. You have to kind of know which order of allegiance you are being held to. In order for us to truly be devoted to true understanding in science, as well as true understanding of the Word of God in religion, we have to be able to combine those two and to live in such a way that they really support each other. a good person of faith can and should draw on faith to be motivated to seek true understanding, to be the best scientist he or she can be, because it is truly an act of worship to be a good scientist. But in order to be the best scientist, you have to see it as an act of worship and not simply as a job that you do because you have to pay the bills. You have to do that too. But to really make it into more than simply a means of survival, you have to have some kind of faith. And you have to integrate all elements of that faith in one comprehensive understanding as to what your life is about. And compartmentalizing is dangerous because it seems to put things into boxes, which one of them may get smaller and smaller and smaller and eventually just go away. We don't want that.
Can I ask you about the soul, Ben?
Yes.
So some would say that's what's missing from the physicalist picture of a person or even an animal is a soul, that if you have all the molecules in the right place, you still don't have a living being. There's another thing called the soul.
Right. It's a very difficult question to respond to as long as we are talking in terms of philosophy and in terms of natural understanding. The philosophical concept that we call soul is often just referred to as the form of the body, the kind of the description of the completeness that is made out of its parts. This becomes very difficult to combine with any description of nature that includes physics. And I mentioned earlier, we can't really try to supplement physics with something else that doesn't belong to it and still expect this assembly to function. Because what you mean by soul and physics is so different that combining those two is almost using contradictory terms. In my own life experience, the only time when I really think about the soul as a distinct being is in the moment of death. Death I can only understand as a Christian as a separation of body and soul. Soul being the continuation of life with God, or body waiting for the resurrection of the dead. But there's some separation that happens in the moment of death that I speak of as separation of body and soul. But now I speak of the human person in relationship to God. I'm no longer speaking of the human person as a creature in creation, like we are right now. So when I speak of the soul, I speak of ways of relating to God after death. In life, the concept of soul is so difficult to use that I don't combine it in any language that also implies physics. It just doesn't fit. Soul is a deeply theological, faith-filled term, and it belongs into this discussion. By soul, I mean that each and every one of us is a creature of God, is known by God, loved by God, desired by God. That element of our existence, that is what I mean by soul. But that is a very different topic from how does physics describe the world. Those things don't fit together. And there are examples for how we have to have very different ways of speaking of our lives. And we have to accept that there are different true ways of speaking of our existence that we cannot reconcile with each other. But that are still us. When I speak of myself in relationship to God as a creature loved by and loving the Creator, then I speak of the world very differently from the physical description.
And it's different in kind. It's not just a shorthand. Some people would grant that talking about people having intentions and goals and desires and an internal experience is valid as long as we understand it is a shorthand for biochemistry of the brain, ultimately. But you're saying those two kinds of statements are different in kind. One is not a shorthand for the other one. Is that right?
Exactly. They're entirely different ways of speaking of life, speaking of personal being, speaking of the world. And as we are not looking at it all from the divine perspective, where everything is united, but as creatures in creation, we look from the inside out. We look in this direction, we look in that direction, we look up, we look down, and we can't see the whole. Any which way we look, we see a part. Our faith in God tells us it is all being kept together, somehow logically consistent, known to Him alone. But when we look, we see only one aspect. We can see multiple aspects, but we can never combine them all into one big picture of everything.